In the grimly shadowed hollows of the Shenandoah Valley, circa 1894, there existed a story, a case file written not in ink, but in the hushed and fearful whispers of a community besieged by a quiet terror. It concerned a boy, blind since birth, who held a chilling and unnatural communion with death. He never shed a tear at the graveside, standing silent and unnervingly still as coffins were lowered into the cold Appalachian earth. But his grief was not absent, merely deferred. It would find its voice in the dead of night as he wept softly on the porches of his neighbors, people who were, for the moment, still very much alive. If the quiet dread of forgotten histories is what you seek, and this is your first time in our archive, consider subscribing, join us in the shadows, and ensure you are present when the next file is unsealed. The year was 1894, a time when life in the mountain settlements of Shenandoah was etched by the rhythms of the seasons and the stark finality of the church bell. Communities were islands in a sea of ancient forests, bound together by shared blood, shared labor, and a shared, ever-present proximity to death. Sickness, accident, and the simple exhaustion of a hard-lived life were constant companions, and the rituals of mourning were woven into the very fabric of their existence. The passing of a soul was a communal event, a tear in the social fabric that required every hand to help mend. Grief was a public spectacle, a necessary and expected outpouring of sorrow that affirmed the value of the life that was lost and the solidarity of those who remained. It was within this rigid framework of ritualized sorrow that the boy first became a subject of communal concern, a silent anomaly in a world that demanded a chorus of lamentation. He was born into the world without sight, a detail the village had long ago accepted as a simple, unfortunate fact of his existence. His world was one of textures, sounds, and the subtle shifts in temperature that signaled the coming of dawn or the fall of night. He navigated the well-worn paths of the village with an uncanny grace, his bare feet reading the compacted earth like a scholar reads a familiar text. The occasion was the funeral of an elderly farmer, a man who had worked the same plot of unforgiving land for over 6 decades and had finally been claimed by the quiet decay of age. The entire village had gathered at the small, whitewashed church that stood as a lonely sentinel on a low hill overlooking the valley. The air inside was thick and heavy, smelling of damp wool, oiled wood, and the faintly sweet, cloying scent of funeral lilies. Light struggled through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced in the solemn air like lost spirits. The congregation was a sea of black and gray, their faces etched with the familiar lines of grief. The deceased farmer's wife, a woman made frail by her sudden solitude, sat in the front pew, her body racked with the silent, rhythmic sobs of the truly heartbroken. Her children, now grown with families of their own, flanked her, their own sorrow a more stoic, restrained echo of her profound loss. The village preacher, a man whose voice had guided countless souls into the next world, spoke in low, somber tones of scripture and resurrection, his words a well-practiced balm for the raw wound of loss. And in the midst of this collective performance of grief, the boy was a pillar of absolute stillness. He stood beside his mother, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder, a small, still point in a turning world of sorrow. While others wept openly, their faces buried in handkerchiefs, his own face remained a placid mask. His sightless eyes, milky and pale, were directed toward the simple pine coffin at the front of the church, but they betrayed no flicker of emotion, no hint of the sadness that saturated the very air around him. He did not fidget. He did not sigh. He simply stood, an impassive statue carved from some strange, unfeeling wood. It was this absolute, preternatural calm that first drew the sidelong glances of the other mourners. A neighbor, dabbing at her own eyes, noted his dry cheeks with a flicker of disquiet. The blacksmith, a large and normally boisterous man, found his own grief momentarily stalled by the sight of the child's utter tranquility. He looked away, a vague sense of unease settling in his gut. Even the preacher, from his pulpit, found his gaze drawn to the boy, this silent, unreadable child who seemed entirely disconnected from the powerful emotional current that swept through the rest of the congregation. The procession to the cemetery was a slow, somber march up the muddy track behind the church. The tolling of the bell was a leaden heartbeat against the gray sky, each clang marking another step toward the inevitable finality of the grave. The coffin, carried on the shoulders of the farmers' sons and neighbors, swayed gently with their funereal rhythm. The villagers followed, their heads bowed, their footsteps heavy on the damp earth. The boy walked with them, his hand now in his mother's, his steps sure and steady. As the coffin was lowered into the freshly dug earth, the sound of weeping intensified. The widow let out a low, guttural cry of such pure anguish that several of the women around her began to weep in sympathy. The first handfuls of dirt struck the lid of the pine box with a series of dull, hollow thuds, a sound that seemed to punctuate the finality of the moment. It was a sound that broke the composure of even the most stoic men, who turned their heads to hide the sudden glisten in their eyes. Yet the boy remained unmoved. He stood at the edge of the grave, a small, solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape of the mountains, his expression as blank and unreadable as a smooth river stone. He listened intently, his head cocked slightly as if cataloging the sounds of sorrow, but not participating in them. There was no grief in him. There was only a profound and unnerving silence. The walk back to the village was a quieter affair. The raw intensity of the graveside service had subsided, leaving in its wake a lingering melancholy and, for some, a persistent sense of unease. The boy's strange detachment had become a topic of hushed conversation, spoken in tones of confusion rather than outright accusation. The schoolteacher, a pragmatic woman from outside the valley, confessed to the general store owner that she found the child's behavior deeply unsettling. She explained that a lack of effective response could be indicative of a profound internal disturbance. The blacksmith mentioned it to his wife as they walked, stating that it was not natural for a child to show no feeling in the face of death. He said that it was as if the boy did not understand what he had just witnessed. His mother, walking a little ahead of the others, could feel the weight of their whispered comments. She held her son's hand tighter, a familiar defensiveness rising in her. She had long ago grown accustomed to his otherness, to the way he experienced the world through senses the rest of them took for granted. She told herself that his blindness was the cause, that he simply could not comprehend the visual spectacle of a funeral and therefore remained emotionally untouched by it. It was a comforting lie, a rational explanation for something that felt deeply irrational. She asked him quietly if he was all right, if he understood what had happened to the old farmer. The boy simply nodded, offering no further explanation, his silence a wall she could not penetrate. That night, a profound stillness descended upon the valley. The moon was a sliver of bone behind a thick veil of clouds, and the houses of the village were small islands of flickering lamplight in an ocean of darkness. The sounds of the Appalachian night were a familiar chorus: the chirping of crickets, the distant call of a hunting owl, the rustle of the wind through the dense canopy of the forest. Inside his small, sturdy home, the blacksmith sat by the fire, the day's events replaying in his mind. His children were asleep, and his wife was quietly mending a tear in a shirt, the rhythmic push and pull of her needle a comforting, domestic sound. He was a man who believed in the tangible world, in the heat of the forge and the solid heft of a hammer. He had little time for the superstitions and ghost stories that were so popular in the more isolated hollows. Yet he could not shake the image of the blind boy standing by the grave, his face a perfect, emotionless mask. It was a detail that did not fit, an anomalous piece of data in the orderly ledger of his world. It was his wife who heard it first. She paused in her sewing, her head tilted, her expression one of focused listening. She asked him to be quiet for a moment. He listened, at first hearing nothing but the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. Then he caught it. It was a faint, thin sound, almost lost beneath the other noises of the night. It was the sound of weeping. It was not the loud, desperate wailing of a person in immediate distress, but a quiet, rhythmic sobbing, full of a sorrow so deep and profound it seemed to make the very air grow cold. The blacksmith rose from his chair and went to the window, peering out into the impenetrable darkness. The sound was coming from the direction of his front porch. His first thought was that it was one of the neighbor's children, lost or in some kind of trouble. He unbolted the heavy wooden door and opened it a crack, the cool night air rushing into the warm room. There, on the edge of his porch, was the boy. He was sitting on the top step, his small body curled in on itself, his shoulders shaking with the force of his silent sobs. He had somehow navigated the dark, winding path from his own home to this one, a feat in itself. But it was not his presence that was so shocking. It was the sound he was making, the raw, unfiltered grief that poured from him. It was the very emotion that had been so conspicuously absent at the funeral earlier that day. The blacksmith stared, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Why was he here? Why was he crying now, hours after the funeral, on the porch of a man who was still very much alive? He called out to the boy, his voice rough with confusion. He asked him what was wrong, if he was lost. The boy did not seem to hear him. He just continued to weep, his face buried in his hands, his small frame trembling in the darkness. The blacksmith's wife came to the door and gasped when she saw the scene. Her initial instinct was one of pity, an urge to go to the child and comfort him, but something held her back. It was the same feeling of deep, instinctual unease that her husband had felt at the cemetery. There was something profoundly wrong with this picture. This was not the grief of a lost child. It was the grief of a mourner, a deep and terrible sorrow that seemed entirely out of place, directed at a house where no one had died. They did not know what to do. To approach him felt like intruding on a sacred and perhaps dangerous ritual. To leave him there felt cruel. For a long moment, they simply stood in the doorway, two ordinary people confronted by an inexplicable mystery. The boy's weeping continued, a lonely, heartbreaking sound in the vast, dark expanse of the Appalachian night. Finally, the blacksmith, a man of action rather than contemplation, made a decision. He closed the door, his hand trembling slightly, and threw the bolt. He told his wife that the boy would find his own way home. He said perhaps the child was simple-minded, his emotions disconnected from the events that were supposed to trigger them. But as he stood there in his own home, listening to the faint, persistent sound of weeping from just outside his walls, he did not believe his own words. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the cold, creeping touch of the unknown. The villagers had witnessed the boy's strange silence in the face of death. Now, two of them had borne witness to its terrible inversion, a profound and inexplicable grief offered not for the dead, but for the living. The question that hung in the air between them, unspoken but deeply felt, was not just why he was crying, but for whom. The story of the blacksmith's nocturnal visitor did not remain confined within the walls of his home. In a community as small and tightly knit as the Shenandoah settlement, secrets were a currency too valuable to hoard. By the next morning, As the sun burned the mist from the valley floor, the tale had already begun its journey. It was passed over a shared fence between two neighbors, whispered across the counter of the general store, and debated by the men who gathered near the grist mill. The initial reaction was one of baffled curiosity. The blacksmith was a man known for his sober and practical nature, not for flights of fancy or a belief in phantoms. His account, therefore, carried a weight it might not have otherwise. Still, the event was treated as a singular, bizarre anomaly, a strange child, a confusing display of emotion. Most concluded, as the blacksmith himself had tried to, that the boy was simply afflicted with a mind that worked in ways others could not comprehend, his emotional clockworks running on a different and unknowable schedule. It was a strange story, yes, but it was not yet a terrifying one. That would come later, with repetition, and with the slow, dawning realization that the boy's misplaced grief was not random, but followed a chilling and inexorable logic. The first true tremor of fear ran through the community 3 weeks later. The subject was an old trapper, a man who lived a solitary existence in a small, dilapidated cabin at the very edge of the village's sphere of influence, where the tamed fields gave way to the untamed wilderness of the mountains. He was a figure more often spoken of than seen, a relic from a wilder time who kept to himself, emerging from the woods only a few times a year to trade his pelts for flour, salt, and ammunition. It was a neighboring farmer, checking on a section of his fence that bordered the trapper's property, who first heard the sound. The sun had set, and the air was growing cool, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. From the direction of the old man's cabin, he heard the same faint, heartbreaking sobbing that the blacksmith had described. The farmer was a cautious man, and the trapper was known to be territorial, his disposition as thorny as the thickets that surrounded his home. He did not investigate. Instead, he retreated to the safety of his own home, the unsettling sound following him through the trees. He mentioned it to his wife, who had heard the blacksmith's story, and a shiver of unease passed between them. 2 days later, the farmer, his curiosity now tinged with a vague sense of foreboding, decided to check on the old man. He found the cabin door slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the trapper lay on the floor near the cold hearth, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. A rickety wooden stool lay on its side nearby. The village doctor was summoned, a man whose medical knowledge was a patchwork of formal training and mountain folklore. After a brief examination, he declared the cause of death to be a broken neck, the result of an accidental fall. The old man had likely been trying to reach something on the high mantel, had lost his footing on the unsteady stool, and had met his end in the lonely silence of his cabin. It was a sad but unremarkable death, the kind of mundane tragedy that was all too common in these isolated parts. The farmer, however, could not shake the memory of the weeping he had heard 2 nights before. He told the doctor about it, and then he told the blacksmith, and then he told the preacher. The connection was tenuous, a mere thread of coincidence, but in the minds of the villagers, a seed of a darker narrative had been planted. They buried the old trapper in the church cemetery, and at this funeral, just as before, the blind boy stood in perfect, emotionless silence. This time, however, his stillness was not just a curiosity, it felt like an indictment. The whispers grew louder, more fearful. The story of the boy's weeping was no longer just a strange tale, it was becoming a legend, a piece of local folklore freighted with a growing sense of dread. The children of the village, with their natural appetite for the macabre, began to tell ghost stories about him, their imaginations painting him as a creature of the night who consorted with spirits. Their parents, while publicly dismissing such talk as childish nonsense, found themselves bolting their doors a little more securely at night, their ears straining to catch any unusual sound in the darkness. The boy himself seemed oblivious to the change in atmosphere. He continued his daily routines, his world of sound and touch unaltered by the fear that was beginning to coil around him. He was no longer just the blind boy. He was becoming something other, an object of suspicion, a vessel for the community's nascent anxieties about the capriciousness of fate. The pattern solidified into a terrifying certainty with the third incident. This time, the tragedy struck not at the periphery of the village, but at its very heart, and it involved not a solitary old man, but a young mother and her only child. The mother was a woman well liked in the community, known for the fierce, almost desperate love she bore for her 5-year-old daughter. The child had been born frail, and the mother had spent the first few years of her life in a state of constant, vigilant terror, watching for any sign of the sicknesses that so easily carried away the young. But the girl had survived, and had grown into a bright, if delicate, child, the center of her mother's world. One hot, oppressive summer night, when the air was thick and still and the chorus of cicadas was a deafening, monotonous drone, the girl developed a fever. It was a common enough ailment, and the mother was not initially alarmed. She bathed her daughter's forehead with cool water and gave her a tincture of willow bark, the standard remedy for such things. She sat by the child's bedside in the small, stuffy room, listening to her shallow breathing, her own body tense with a familiar, maternal anxiety. It was well past midnight when she heard it. At first, she thought it was the cry of some nocturnal animal, a fox or a raccoon. It was a thin, mournful sound, rising and falling with a steady, rhythmic grief. She went to the window and looked out into the moon-drenched yard, and then she saw him. The blind boy was sitting on the lowest step of her porch, his back to the door, his small body shaking with sobs. A wave of cold, nauseating terror washed over the mother. The stories, the whispers, the rumors, they all came crashing into her mind at once. This was not a coincidence. This was an announcement. Her first instinct was one of furious, protective rage. She wanted to throw open the door and scream at him, to drive him away from her home, to physically repel the bad luck, the evil omen that he represented. But she was paralyzed by fear. To acknowledge him, she thought, would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of his terrible vigil. So she did nothing. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs, and returned to her daughter's bedside. She barred the door and stuffed a rag into the keyhole, as if she could physically prevent the sound and what it signified from entering the house. For the rest of the night, she sat in the dark, clutching her daughter's hand, praying with a desperate, frantic intensity she had not known since the child's infancy. She prayed not just for her daughter's health, but for the weeping to stop, for the omen to be proven false. But the sound continued, a constant, sorrowful counterpoint to her daughter's fevered breaths, until the first gray light of dawn finally silenced it. Over the next 3 days, the mother watched in helpless agony as her daughter's condition worsened. The fever did not break. A deep, rattling cough developed in the child's chest, and her breathing became a labored, painful struggle. The village doctor was called. He listened to the girl's chest with a grim expression, his face offering no comfort. He spoke of inflammation of the lungs, of a miasma in the air. He prescribed mustard plasters and herbal steam, remedies that did nothing to halt the inexorable progress of the illness. The mother never left the child's side. She was living in a nightmare, and the soundtrack to that nightmare was the memory of the boy's weeping. It was a sound that was now seared into her consciousness, a harbinger of the tragedy that was now unfolding in her arms. On the 4th day, as a merciful rain finally broke the oppressive heat of the summer, the child died. The funeral was a wrenching affair. The entire village turned out, their faces a mixture of genuine sorrow for the young mother and a new, more personal terror. The sight of the small, simple coffin was a stark reminder of their own vulnerability, of the fragility of the lives they held so dear. When the mother arrived at the church, her face was a mask of exhausted, hollow-eyed grief. But when she saw the blind boy standing in his usual place beside his own mother, her sorrow curdled into a cold, hard fury. After the service, as the mourners offered her their clumsy condolences, she broke her silence. Her voice, though quiet, was sharp and clear, cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the churchyard. She told them all what she had seen. She described the boy sitting on her porch, weeping in the darkness. She said that he had not been mourning a death that had happened, but one that was yet to come. She declared that his tears were not tears of sorrow, but of prophecy. He was an omen, a messenger of death who walked among them. Her words landed like stones in the placid pond of the community's denial. It was one thing to whisper about coincidences and strange behavior. It was another entirely to hear it from the lips of a grieving mother, to have the pattern laid bare with such raw, emotional certainty. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface of village life now boiled over into open discussion. The men gathered in the blacksmith's forge, the heat from the fire no match for the chill of their conversation. The women spoke of it in hushed tones as they drew water from the communal well. The question was no longer whether the boy's weeping was connected to the subsequent deaths. That was now accepted as a terrifying fact. The question now, the one that haunted their days and poisoned their nights, was what he was. Was he a curse, an active agent of the tragedies, somehow calling them down upon the houses he visited? Or was he something else, a prophet, a reluctant seer burdened with a terrible foreknowledge, his tears a helpless expression of a fate he was powerless to change? The village elders, an informal council composed of the preacher, the store owner, and two of the most respected farmers, met one evening in the back room of the general store to discuss the matter. The air was thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and apprehension. The preacher, a man who saw the world through the lens of Scripture, argued that the boy might be a vessel, either for a divine warning or a demonic influence. He spoke of the prophets of the Old Testament who were tasked with delivering news of God's wrath. He also spoke of possession, of dark spirits that could inhabit the bodies of the innocent. The store owner, a man of commerce and practicality, was more skeptical. He spoke of mob mentality and the dangers of superstition. He argued that they were connecting unrelated events, that fear was making them see patterns where none existed. One of the farmers, a man who had lived his entire life according to the signs and portents of the natural world, disagreed strongly. He said that there were things that could not be explained by logic or by Scripture. He said that the mountains held old secrets, and that the boy was clearly touched by something from a world beyond their own. They debated for hours, their voices low and tense, but they could reach no consensus. They were caught between the competing narratives of faith, reason, and folklore, and none offered a satisfying explanation for the quiet, weeping boy who had become the fulcrum of their collective fear. The meeting ended without a resolution, but with a shared understanding. The village could not continue like this, living under the shadow of this terrible, unpredictable grief. The suspicion had festered for too long. It was time for a confrontation. They had to go to the boy, to his family, and demand an answer. The fear had finally galvanized them into a need for action. The uneasy truce between reason and fear, so carefully maintained by the village elders, was shattered by the grieving mother's public accusation. Her words had given the formless dread a name and a face, and in doing so, had made it something that could be confronted. The decision, once made, spread through the community, not like a reasoned plan, but like a fever. It was a consensus born of shared terror, a desperate need to do something, anything, to reassert control over a world that had begun to feel menacingly unpredictable. The confrontation was set for that very night. There would be no waiting, no time for the initial heat of their resolve to cool into the cold sweat of second thoughts. The church, the epicenter of their communal life in both celebration and sorrow, was the only conceivable venue. It was a place of judgment, a house of God that would now serve as a crucible for their fear. As twilight bled into true dark, the village began to mobilize. It was not a formal summons, but a silent, inexorable gathering. Men left their supper tables half-eaten, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. They took down lanterns from their hooks and lit torches from their hearths, the sputtering flames casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar paths into alien landscapes. The light was not for illumination, but for courage. It was an act of defiance against the encroaching darkness, both literal and metaphorical. The procession to the church was a near silent affair, punctuated only by the crunch of boots on the dirt track and the nervous coughing of the men. They moved as a single body, a river of anxious humanity flowing toward the stark, white silhouette of the church on the hill. Inside, the preacher had lit every candle he possessed. The space, usually so comforting in its dim solemnity, was now ablaze with a harsh, flickering light that seemed to make the shadows deeper and more agitated. The air was cold, smelling of candle wax, old wood, and the damp chill of the stone foundation. The villagers filed in, not taking their usual places in the pews, but clustering together in the center of the room, their bodies forming a tight, anxious circle. They were no longer a congregation, they were a tribunal. The blacksmith stood near the front, his massive arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of conflicted duty. He felt the wrongness of this gathering in his bones, yet he also understood the fear that drove it. The grieving mother was there, her eyes burning with a dry, feverish intensity. She was the focal point of the crowd's anger, the living embodiment of their collective grievance. The task of fetching the boy and his mother fell to two of the church deacons, sturdy, respectable farmers, who approached the small cabin with a heavy sense of reluctance. They did not shout or threaten. They simply knocked on the door, their presence in the dead of night, flanked by the distant glow of the torchlit church. Message enough. The boy's mother opened the door, her face pale in the lantern light. She saw the grim expressions of the men, saw the ominous gathering on the hill, and a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She had known this was coming. She had felt it building for weeks, in the averted gazes of her neighbors, in the sudden silence that fell when she entered the general store. The deacons delivered the preacher's message. They did not call it a demand, but the word hung in the air between them. The preacher wished to speak with the boy. The community wished to ask him some questions. The mother's first instinct was to refuse, to bar the door and protect her son from the fear she knew was waiting for him. She had spent his entire life acting as a buffer between his strange, silent world and the one outside, but she knew, with a sinking certainty, that refusal was no longer an option. To deny them now would be an admission of guilt, a confirmation of their darkest suspicions. It would only make the inevitable reckoning worse. She looked at her son, who was sitting at the small table, his head cocked as if listening to the tense silence outside. He seemed entirely calm, his placid expression betraying no fear. She took a deep breath, her one humanizing moment of resolve before the horror, and told the deacons that they would come. The walk to the church was the longest of her life. She held her son's hand, her grip so tight her knuckles were white. She could feel the eyes of the village on them from every darkened window they passed. They were not her neighbors anymore. They were watchers, judges. When they entered the church, a collective indrawn breath seemed to suck the very air from the room. The sea of faces turned toward them, 100 variations of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. The mother led her son to the center of the room, placing herself protectively behind him, her hands on his small shoulders. She stood defiant, her fear a cold, hard stone in her gut, but her expression a mask of maternal steel. The preacher stepped forward, his Bible held in his hands like a shield. He was a man accustomed to speaking with authority, but now his voice was strained, heavy with the weight of his community's terror. He began by speaking of the recent sorrows that had befallen them, of the good souls they had lost. He spoke of the fear that had taken root in their hearts, a fear that was poisoning them, turning neighbor against neighbor. Then, his gaze fell upon the small, still figure of the boy. He addressed him directly, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He told the boy that people were frightened. He spoke of the stories, of his weeping outside the homes of those who had then passed into the Lord's keeping. He asked him, his voice a mixture of pastoral concern and prosecutorial sharpness, to explain himself. He demanded to know if the boy was the cause of these tragedies, or if he was merely their herald. A heavy silence descended upon the church. Every eye was fixed on the boy, waiting. The child did not move for a long moment. The only sound was the frantic, panicked beating of his mother's heart, which she was sure everyone in the room could hear. Then, the boy spoke. His voice, when it came, was shockingly soft, a thin, quiet sound that seemed impossibly fragile in the tense, crowded room. It was not the voice of a demon or a prophet. It was the voice of a child. He said that he was sorry for their fear. He explained that he did not mean to cause anyone distress. The preacher pressed him, his voice growing harder. He asked him how he knew. He asked how he chose the houses where he kept his sorrowful vigil. The boy turned his head slightly, his sightless eyes seeming to look directly at the preacher. He said that he did not choose. He explained that he did not see the world as they did, but that he heard it with a clarity they could not imagine. He described the village not as a collection of houses and faces, but as a tapestry of sounds, the rhythm of heartbeats, the whisper of breath in sleeping lungs, the low hum of life that emanated from every living creature. It was their life song, he called it. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the confession they had expected. It was something far stranger, something that skirted the edges of blasphemy. The grieving mother stepped forward, her face contorted with a pain that was indistinguishable from rage. She cried out, her voice cracking, that her daughter had a life song. She demanded to know why he had wept for her before she was gone. The boy flinched at the raw anguish in her voice. He turned his head toward the sound, his own face for the first time showing a flicker of deep, resonant sorrow. He answered her, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with a chilling certainty. He said that a few days before a person died, their song began to change. He explained that it was not a sudden silence, but a gradual fading, a slow, discordant unraveling of the music he had always heard. He told them he could hear the body preparing to fail, the life force beginning to recede, a sound he described as a low, quiet hum that slowly went out of tune. He said it was a sound of profound loneliness, of a soul beginning its slow, inexorable departure from the world. This, he said, was what he mourned. He wept not for the living, nor for the dead. He wept for those who were already walking in the shadow, for those who had been, in his own soft-spoken, terrifying words, already marked for the grave. The church was utterly silent. The very air seemed to crackle with the weight of his claim. He had given them an answer, but it was an answer more terrifying than anything they could have imagined. He was not a curse. He was not a harbinger. He was a witness. He was a sentient tuning fork for the vibrations of death itself. The concept of being marked struck a chord of primal terror in their hearts. It implied a predestination, a hidden ledger of fate that was utterly beyond their control. It meant that death was not a sudden event, but a process, a creeping decay that could be heard by this sightless child long before its victim felt the first symptom. The preacher, for the first time that night, seemed at a loss for words. His scripture had no answer for this. The blacksmith stared at the boy, a new kind of horror dawning on his face. He remembered the sound of the boy weeping on his porch, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin. Had he been marked? Had his own song begun to fade, only to somehow right itself? The thought was a physical violation, a glimpse into a terrible, hidden reality he did not want to see. The boy's explanation had not brought release. It had brought a more refined and potent form of terror. It was the terror of the unseen, the unheard, the unknown. It was the fear that at any moment, your own internal music could begin to fade, and this small blind child would be the only one to hear it. The gathering broke apart not with a shout, but with a slow, fearful dissolution. There was no resolution, no catharsis. The villagers filed out of the church, their torches now seeming to offer less comfort, their light pushing back a darkness that was now understood to be inside them as well as out. They walked back to their homes in small, hushed groups, the boys' words echoing in their minds. The community had not been united by the confrontation. It had been fractured. A deep, ideological schism was torn through the fabric of the village that night. For some, the boy was now an object of profound, almost holy, awe. They saw him as a tragic seer, burdened with a terrible, divine gift. They believed he was a warning system, a living memento mori who reminded them of their own mortality. For others, and they were the majority, his explanation only confirmed their deepest fears. He was tainted. He was an intimate of death, a creature who trafficked in a knowledge that was not meant for mortals. To them, it did not matter if he caused the deaths or merely perceived their coming. His very presence was a contamination. The fading song he described was a disease, and he was its only visible symptom. Their fear, once a general anxiety about death, now had a singular focus. It was no longer enough to understand him. They felt an urgent, growing need to insulate themselves from him, to drive out the entity that could hear the grim music of their own finality. The confrontation had failed, and in its failure, it had paved the way for something far darker. The seeds of persecution had been sown in the hard, fearful soil of the human heart. The boy's testimony did not cleanse the village of its fear. It gave it a new and more terrible shape. The confrontation in the church was intended to be an exorcism, a lancing of the boil of communal anxiety. Instead, it had been an inoculation. The boy's words, meant to explain, had injected a more potent strain of terror directly into the heart of the community. The idea of a fading song, of a perceptible, audible decay that preceded death, was a concept far more horrifying than any simple curse. A curse could be fought, an evil could be banished. But a truth, especially one that came from a world of senses they could not access, was absolute and inescapable. The villagers left the church that night fundamentally changed. They were no longer just a community of people. They were a collection of walking songs, each one now acutely, terrifyingly aware that its melody could at any moment begin to fail, and that only the blind boy would know it. This knowledge did not foster empathy or awe. It fostered a deep and visceral resentment. He was the possessor of an obscene secret, a constant, living reminder of their own hidden fragility. In the days that followed, a cold and silent persecution began. It was not a campaign of open violence, not yet, but a systematic and suffocating quarantine of the soul. The boy and his mother were rendered invisible. When the mother walked to the general store, the other women would fall silent, turning their backs to busy themselves with sacks of flour or bolts of cloth, their very posture a wall of exclusion. The store owner, a man who had once argued for reason, now served her with a clipped, fearful efficiency, his eyes never meeting hers, his hands seeming to recoil from the coins she placed on the counter. The other children, who had once treated the boy with a mixture of pity and childish curiosity, now saw him as a monster from one of their darker fairy tales. They would stop their games when he approached, their laughter dying in their throats, only to be replaced by whispered taunts from a safe distance. They called him the Death Singer, the Grave Watcher. Their cruelty was a pure, unfiltered reflection of the fear they absorbed at their parents' dinner tables. The villagers, in their terror, were teaching their own children how to hate. This social exile was accompanied by a strange resurgence of older, deeper superstitions. Fear had stripped away the thin veneer of Christian piety and revealed the pagan heart that still beat beneath the floorboards of the church. Houses that the boy might pass on his way through the village began to sprout a bizarre foliage of protective charms. Twisted branches of rowan, a tree believed to guard against dark enchantments, were nailed above doorways. Small, cloth pouches filled with salt and yarrow were hung from window latches. The blacksmith, a man who had once scoffed at such things, was seen affixing a cold iron horseshoe to his own door, the act performed with a grim, almost liturgical solemnity. These were the desperate gestures of people trying to make their homes sonically invisible, to mute their own life songs and shield them from the boy's terrible listening. They were trying to ward off a prophecy, to bar the door not against a physical intruder, but against a piece of knowledge they could not bear to receive. The village was no longer just a place. It was a battleground of competing acoustics, with every family trying to deafen the one boy who could truly hear. The psychological shift that had begun in the church now reached its logical and most dangerous conclusion. It became an article of faith among the most fearful that the boy was not merely a passive observer. The grieving mother, in her bottomless well of sorrow, became the chief architect of this new doctrine. She began to speak to her neighbors, her voice a low and compelling whisper of conviction. She suggested that perhaps the boy's attention was not benign. She posed a question, like a seed of nightshade planted in fertile soil. What if his weeping was not a reaction to the fading song, but the cause of its fading? What if his grief was a kind of psychic venom, a focused beam of sorrow that actively unraveled the life force of its victim? This idea was a terrible comfort. It reframed the narrative from one of helpless predestination to one of active assault. If the boy was an attacker, then they were not merely victims waiting for their song to fade. They were a populace under siege, and they had a right to defend themselves. The preacher, seeing his flock consumed by a fear his sermons could not soothe, began to subtly endorse this view. He did not name the boy, but he spoke from the pulpit of unseen influences, of whited sepulchres, of those who carried a darkness within them that could blight the souls of others. He gave their fear a theological framework, a divine permission to see the boy not as a disabled child, but as a moral and spiritual threat. The apathetic hand of fate was now viewed as the deliberate, malevolent act of a child. The final piece of evidence they needed, the final push from persecution into open violence, came with the sickness of the schoolteacher's husband. He was a quiet, bookish man, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn farmers and laborers of the village. He fell ill with a fever and a cough, a common enough affliction in the damp chill of autumn. In another time, it would have caused little concern, but now it was a spark in a powder keg. A neighbor claimed to have seen the blind boy walking down the path near the schoolteacher's house 2 days prior. The news spread like wildfire. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded the village. This was not a frail child or a reclusive old man. This was a healthy man in the prime of his life. If he could be marked, then anyone could. The schoolteacher, a woman of logic and reason, found her own home transformed into the epicenter of the village's hysteria. She saw the fearful, accusing glances of her neighbors. She heard the whispers. Her husband's simple illness was now a public spectacle, a test case for their new theory of malevolent prophecy. That night, the fear finally boiled over into rage. A group of men, their courage fortified with whiskey at the small, unnamed tavern on the edge of the settlement, decided that enough was enough. They were led, not by the village's natural leaders, but by a handful of its most frightened and volatile members. The blacksmith was among them, his presence lending a reluctant legitimacy to the gathering. He was a man torn between his conscience and the visceral, unforgettable memory of hearing that soft, sorrowful weeping on his own porch. His own terror made him a reluctant leader of the mob. They lit their torches, the flames painting their faces in demonic shades of orange and black, and they began to march. There was no plan, no clear objective beyond a raw, primal urge to do something, to confront the source of their terror and excise it. Their arrival at the small cabin on the edge of the woods was a violation of the night's peace. The dogs of the village, sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, began to bark, a frantic, ragged chorus that echoed across the valley. The mob surrounded the small house, their torchlight driving the shadows back into the trees, creating a claustrophobic, artificial stage. The blacksmith, pushed forward by the men behind him, hammered on the thin wooden door. The boy's mother opened it. She was not surprised. She looked at the faces in the crowd, saw their fear-crazed eyes, and knew that the final line had been crossed. She stood in the doorway, a small, unyielding figure, and demanded to know what they wanted. A volley of accusations answered her. One man shouted that his son was sick and that the boy had brought the illness. Another screamed that they would not wait for him to cry on their porches, that they would not be the next to be marked. They told her the boy was a curse, an abomination, and that he had to be driven out of the valley for the good of them all. The mother did not flinch. She told them they were fools, cowards who were afraid of their own shadows. She said their fear had made them blind, far blinder than her son would ever be. From behind her, in the dim interior of the cabin, the boy appeared. He stood beside his mother, his hand finding hers in the darkness. He was not crying. His face was as calm and impassive as it had been at the funerals. He stood before the raging, torch-wielding mob with an unnerving tranquility, as if he were listening to something far beyond their shouted threats, a deeper and more fundamental music. His stillness was an infuriating counterpoint to their hysteria. It was as if he was immune to their rage, which only served to fuel it. A young farmer, his face slick with sweat and whiskey, lost control. He stooped down, picked up a rock from the path, and hurled it. The stone missed the woman and the boy, but it struck the side of the cabin with a loud, violent crack. The sound broke the spell. It was the first undeniable act of violence. Another stone followed, and then another. The mob surged forward, their individual fears coalescing into a single mindless entity of aggression. But before they could take another step, the preacher, who had been alerted to the commotion, arrived. He ran into the center of the crowd, his arms outstretched, his face a mask of shame and horror. He berated them, telling them they were behaving like heathens, that they would bring God's wrath down upon themselves with this madness. His authority, combined with the shame of their own actions, was enough to break the mob's momentum. They faltered, the fire in their eyes dimming to a sullen, guilty glow. They began to disperse, melting back into the darkness from which they had come, leaving behind only the lingering smell of torch smoke and the deep, psychic wound of their own violence. The next morning, a profound and heavy silence hung over the village. The air was thick with a collective, unspoken shame, but beneath that shame was a current of profound relief. A neighbor, on his way to his fields, noticed that there was no smoke rising from the chimney of the small cabin. He walked closer and saw that the door was slightly ajar. He called out, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open and looked inside. The cabin was empty. The boy and his mother were gone. They had taken nothing but what they could carry and had vanished into the vast, indifferent wilderness of the mountains. A wave of relief, so powerful it was almost dizzying, washed over the village as the news spread. They had done it. They had driven out the darkness. The curse was lifted. Their songs were safe. The silence left by the boy's absence felt clean, pure, and blessedly, wonderfully normal. For the first time in months, the villagers could breathe freely, unafraid of the sounds of the night, unafraid of the future. Their terror had created its own violence, and that violence, it seemed, had worked. They did not yet understand that the silence he left behind was not an absence of fear, but a new and far more terrifying void. They had not banished their omen. They had merely blinded themselves. The ether left by the boy's departure was, for a brief period, one of profound and almost giddy relief. The village seemed to collectively exhale a breath it had been holding for months. The sun, in the days that followed, seemed to shine a little brighter. The air felt cleaner, and the familiar sounds of village life, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children, the lowing of cattle, were no longer freighted with a sinister undercurrent. They were just sounds again, simple and unambiguous. The protective charms, the rowan branches and pouches of salt, remained on the doors and windows, but they were now relics of a conquered fear, monuments to a victory won. The schoolteacher's husband, the man whose illness had been the catalyst for the final, violent confrontation, recovered. His fever broke, his cough subsided, and within a week he was back on his feet, pale and a little weak, but undeniably alive. This was taken as the ultimate proof. The villagers saw it as a direct and incontrovertible sign that they had been right. They had identified the source of the affliction and, through their collective will, had driven it from their midst. They had saved the man, they had saved themselves. A quiet, smug satisfaction settled over the community. They had faced a supernatural threat and had emerged triumphant. This fragile peace, born of shame and delusion, lasted for a little over 2 weeks. It was a period of deliberate, enforced normalcy. The villagers went about their business with a determined cheerfulness, their conversations kept to the safe, shallow waters of crops, weather, and local gossip. The boy's name was never mentioned. He and his mother had been excised from the communal memory as cleanly as a surgeon removes a tumor. To speak of them would be to acknowledge the ugliness of what had happened, to admit that their relief had been purchased at the cost of a violent, mob-driven persecution of a disabled child and his parent. The silence was not just an absence of his name, it was an active, complicit agreement to forget. But the Appalachian Mountains are an ancient and patient observer, and they are not easily swayed by the fragile constructs of human denial. The silence the villagers so cherished was not a void, but a vacuum, and the universe, as a rule, abhors a vacuum. The first crack in their carefully constructed reality appeared without warning. The blacksmith's youngest son, a robust and energetic child of 6, complained one evening of a pain in his stomach. The family thought little of it. Children were always complaining of one ache or another. They gave him a warm drink and put him to bed. The next morning, He was dead. The village doctor was summoned, his face a mask of grim confusion. He examined the boy's body, finding no sign of injury, no rash, no fever, none of the usual markers of the diseases he knew how to name. He could offer no explanation. He spoke vaguely of a sudden, internal malady, a blockage of the humors, a failure of the heart. His medical lexicon had no name for a death that arrived so swiftly, so silently, and with no apparent cause. The blacksmith and his wife were shattered. Their grief was a raw, primal thing, a howling vortex of pain and disbelief. But beneath their sorrow was a new and terrifying feeling, a profound and unnerving sense of exposure. There had been no warning. There had been no weeping on their porch, no audible announcement of the coming tragedy. Death had simply arrived, a silent thief in the night, and had stolen their child from under their very roof. The carefully built walls of their relief came crashing down, leaving them naked and vulnerable in a world that was once again menacing and unpredictable. The boy's funeral was a somber, fearful affair. The villagers gathered at the church, their faces etched with a renewed anxiety. They looked at the small coffin, and they did not just see the blacksmith's son. They saw their own children, their own spouses, their own selves. The absence of the blind boy at the service was a palpable presence. His stillness, once so unnerving, was now a void that screamed with unspoken meaning. They found themselves looking for him, their eyes scanning the back of the church, as if they expected him to materialize from the shadows. His presence had been a terror, but they were beginning to understand that his absence was something far worse. It was the difference between knowing a storm is coming and being struck by lightning from a clear blue sky. 2 more deaths followed in quick succession, each one as sudden and inexplicable as the last. An elderly woman, known for her sharp tongue and resilient constitution, was found in her chair by her daughter, a half-finished piece of knitting still in her lap. She had been speaking with her daughter not an hour before, seemingly in perfect health. A young farmer, a man in the prime of his life, collapsed in his field while mending a fence, his heart, according to the baffled doctor, having simply stopped. Each death was a fresh hammer blow against the village's crumbling sense of security. The narrative they had so carefully constructed, the one in which they were the heroes who had driven out the monster, was revealed to be a childish fantasy. They had not banished the darkness. They had only extinguished their only lamp. The fear that returned was a colder, more intelligent strain than the one that had come before. The previous fear had been focused, directed at the boy. It was a fear that could be acted upon. This new fear was diffuse, omnidirectional, and utterly paralyzing. It was the dread of the unknown, the terror of a threat that had no face, no voice, and no warning. The villagers, who had once shunned the boy, now found themselves desperately, perversely, wishing for his return. The sound of his weeping, once a harbinger of doom, was now remembered with a strange and bitter nostalgia. It had been a terrible sound, yes, but it had been a sound. It had been a signal. It had offered, if not hope, then at least the illusion of order. It had implied a universe with rules, however cruel. The silence that now greeted them each night was a far more profound and existential terror. It was the sound of a universe that was utterly random and indifferent, a universe where death could arrive at any moment, for any reason, without any warning at all. The villagers began to see the boy not as a curse, but as a sentinel. They had been living on the shores of a dark and dangerous ocean, and he had been their lighthouse, his mournful cries a beam of light that warned of the rocks hidden just beneath the surface. In their fear and arrogance, they had smashed the lantern and were now hopelessly adrift in the darkness, praying they would not hear the sound of their own lives splintering against the unseen shore. One morning, Nearly a month after he had vanished, the boy reappeared. It was the store owner who saw him first. He had risen before dawn to unload a new shipment of goods, and as the first, thin, gray light of morning began to silhouette the trees, he saw a small figure sitting at the edge of the cemetery. The boy was not on the path, nor near any of the recent graves. He was sitting on the low stone wall that separated the consecrated ground from the wild woods beyond, a liminal figure perched on the border between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. He was not weeping. He was simply sitting, his body perfectly still, his head cocked as if listening to the silent stones that surrounded him. He looked smaller, thinner, his clothes ragged from his time in the wilderness. There was an aura about him that had not been there before, an ethereal, almost ghostly quality, as if his time away had thinned the veil between his world and whatever other world he communed with. The news of his return spread through the village, not as a cause for alarm, but as a source of desperate, irrational hope. Perhaps, they thought, now that he was back, the random deaths would stop. Perhaps his presence alone would restore the old, terrible order. But the boy did not return to the village. He remained at his post on the cemetery wall, a silent, solitary watcher. He did not go to his old home. He did not seek out his mother, who was nowhere to be seen, and whose fate remained a terrible, unspoken question. He simply sat, day and night, through sun and rain, an unmoving fixture in the landscape of their fear. The villagers would watch him from a distance, their fear now mixed with a strange, supplicant awe. They left offerings for him at the cemetery gate, a loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, a small, carved wooden bird. The offerings always disappeared, but no one ever saw him take them. He had ceased to be a child. He had become a piece of folklore, a living ghost, a spirit of the land that they now sought to appease. But the random deaths did not stop. A week after his return, another man died, his heart giving out as he slept. The boy had not wept for him. He had not moved from his post on the wall. His return had not brought salvation. It had only deepened the mystery. They had their sentinel back, but his light was no longer working. He was no longer warning them. He was simply watching, listening, as if he, too, were waiting for some final, terrible act to unfold. And as they watched him, a new, even more disturbing thought began to take root in their minds. The boy himself looked unwell. There was a pallor to his skin, a fragility to his small frame. It was as if the terrible gift he carried, the constant, psychic burden of listening to the fading songs of the world, was beginning to consume him. The omen was turning inward, and the village, now utterly stripped of its arrogance, could only watch and wait and wonder who he would weep for next. The fragile equilibrium that had settled over the valley, a state of being suspended between terror and a desperate hope for meaning, was finally and irrevocably broken on a cold, rain-swept night in late autumn. The wind, a mournful entity in its own right, howled down from the mountain gaps, stripping the last of the dead leaves from the skeletal branches of the trees and rattling the window panes of the small, fearful houses. It was a night for staying indoors, for huddling close to the fire and praying for the dawn. It was on this night that the boy's long, silent vigil at the edge of the cemetery finally came to an end. A farmer, whose land bordered the church property, was woken in the deep hours of the night by the sound of his animals, a nervous, unsettled shifting in the nearby barn. Believing a fox or a wolf to be prowling, he took up his lantern and went out into the gale, the wind immediately threatening to extinguish the small flame. As he secured the latch on the barn door, his ears, attuned to the symphony of the night, caught a new sound, a thin thread of noise woven into the tapestry of the storm. It was not the wind. It was a sound he had not heard in months, a sound he had come to both dread and, in a strange, perverse way, to miss. It was the sound of weeping. His first thought was a jolt of pure, instinctual panic. He scanned the darkness in the direction of his own home, his heart seizing with the terrifying thought that the weeping was for him, for his wife, for one of his children. But the sound was not coming from his porch. He held the lantern high, its light a small, fragile bubble in the immense, roaring darkness, and he followed the sound. It led him away from his home, down the muddy track toward the village. The weeping grew stronger, clearer, a sound of such profound and desolate sorrow that it seemed to be the very voice of the storm itself. It led him to the small, abandoned cabin at the edge of the woods, the place where the boy had once lived with his mother, the place that the villagers had shunned for months, a structure that was already beginning to be reclaimed by the encroaching wilderness. And there, on the dilapidated porch, soaked to the bone by the driving rain, was the boy. He was huddled against the door of his own empty home, his small body racked with the most violent and desperate sobs any of the villagers had ever heard from him. This was not the quiet, rhythmic grief of his previous vigils. This was a raw, unrestrained outpouring of absolute agony, the sound of a heart breaking under a weight too immense to bear. The farmer stood frozen, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp, the lantern light flickering wildly in his trembling hand. He was witnessing the final, terrible piece of the puzzle falling into place. The boy had wept for the old, for the sick, for the young, for the victims of accident and sudden illness. Now, for the first and only time, he was weeping for himself. The omen had finally and irrevocably turned inward. The farmer did not approach him. To do so would have felt like a profound and terrible sacrilege, an interruption of a sacred and horrifying ritual. He retreated back into the storm, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had seen. He did not go back to bed. He sat in his dark kitchen, listening to the rain and the wind, and waited for the morning. When the first weak, gray light of dawn broke through the clouds, he went to the preacher's house and told him what he had witnessed. The news spread through the village with the speed of a contagion, but this time it did not bring fear or anger. It brought a deep, soul-crushing wave of pity and a profound, collective guilt. The monster they had created in their minds, the demonic entity they had persecuted and driven out, was, in the end, just a child. A child who was now facing his own end, alone, on the doorstep of the home from which they had banished him. A small group of the village women, led by the blacksmith's wife, gathered what courage they had and went to the cabin. They found him there, no longer weeping, but lying on the porch, his small body limp and still. He was unconscious, his skin deathly pale and cold to the touch. A faint, shallow flutter of breath, the only sign that he was still alive. They carried him inside, out of the rain, and laid him on the simple rope bed that was the only piece of furniture left in the cabin. They built a fire in the hearth and wrapped him in dry blankets, their movements full of a gentle, desperate urgency. It was a kindness that had come far, far too late. For 2 days, the boy lingered. He never regained full consciousness, but drifted in a twilight state between worlds. The women of the village took turns sitting with him, bathing his forehead, trying to spoon a little broth or water between his lips. The village doctor came and stood over him, his face a mask of helpless impotence. There was no fever to break, no wound to bind. The ailment that was claiming the boy was not of the flesh. It was a sickness of the spirit, an exhaustion of the soul. The terrible gift he had carried, the constant burden of hearing the world's quiet symphony of decay, had finally consumed him. He was a vessel that had been filled with too much sorrow, and now he was simply breaking apart. The villagers came and stood in the doorway of the cabin, their faces a study in conflicted emotions. They looked at the small, frail form on the bed, and they saw the culmination of their own story, the final, tragic chapter of the fear they had allowed to fester and grow. They were not just watching a child die, they were watching a piece of their own history, a piece of their own souls, expire. On the morning of the third day, as a watery sun finally broke through the clouds, the boy died. He passed quietly, without a struggle, his last, shallow breath, a silent surrender to the silence he had so long foretold for others. His burial was unlike any other the village had ever held. It was attended by every man, woman, and child, a silent, somber assembly at the small cemetery on the hill. The rain had passed, but the sky remained a uniform and melancholy gray, and the ground was soft and wet, the sound of their footsteps a dull, sodden squelch. They buried him not far from the wall where he had kept his final vigil, in a small, unmarked plot. The preacher stood over the simple pine coffin, his Bible open in his hands, but for a long time he could not find the words. What could be said? What scripture could possibly encompass the strange, terrible, and sorrowful life of the child who lay before them? He spoke, finally, not of sin or salvation, but of mysteries. He told his congregation that there were things in God's creation that were not meant for human understanding. He spoke of the boy as a burden bearer, a soul who had been tasked with carrying a knowledge too heavy for any mortal to bear. His words were an attempt at absolution, a way to reframe their own guilt as a simple, human failure to comprehend the divine. But the villagers were not so easily comforted. As the small coffin was lowered into the wet, dark earth, there was no sense of relief. There was only a profound and unsettling emptiness. They had been haunted by his presence, and then by his absence, and now they were to be haunted by his memory for the rest of their days. The village lived on, the seasons turned, children were born, the old passed away, but the story of the blind boy who wept for the living became a part of the very soil of the place, a piece of foundational folklore that was passed down from one generation to the next. It was a story told by the fireside on long winter nights, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, a ghost story that had the unnerving quality of being entirely true. The community was forever marked by the events of that year. A certain watchfulness entered their collective character, a deep-seated awareness of their own mortality that had been branded into them by the boy's terrible gift. And a strange, new legend was born in the years after his death. People, when they were alone at night, walking the dark paths between the houses, would sometimes claim to hear it, a faint, thin sound, almost lost beneath the chirping of the crickets and the sighing of the wind. The sound of quiet weeping, coming from the porch of a neighbor, or from the edge of the woods, or sometimes, most terrifyingly, from just outside their own window. There was no longer a boy to see, no physical source for the sound. But the memory of his grief had been so powerful, so profound, that it had somehow imprinted itself upon the landscape, a residual haunting that could never be erased. They were left with the final, unanswerable question, a question that would echo down through the generations. Had they persecuted and killed a curse that had been sent to destroy them? Or had they, in their blindness and their terror, destroyed a guardian, a tragic and unwilling prophet, whose tears had been the only thing standing between them and the terrifying, silent randomness of the grave? They would never know. They were left with only the silence and the lingering, unshakable feeling that they were still being watched and listened to by the boy who had heard the music of their end. The case file on the Appalachian blind boy is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.